Hello, and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. Well, today I have a very special episode for you. Previous show guest and great friend of mine, Dr. Emma Cahill Marron, is the host today, and the topic is all about art history, so I can't wait to share this one with you. I hope you enjoy it.
The Tudors Dynasty podcast.
Hi everyone, it's Emma. How are you? Today at the Tudors Dynasty podcast, I'm the host. I am here joined by someone who's just launched one of his new books in English that I had the privilege of reading in Spanish. Welcome, Alejandro. How are you?
Hi, Emma. I'm great. Thank you. You're very generous to host this podcast with me and to talk about my new book and whatever comes out and to relate that to the Tudors. Let's see what we can make of all this.
I'm sure there is, because I have some questions for you after reading your book. So, the book just came out in English. I read it. The book came out last year in Spanish. I was lucky enough I have a signed copy of the book in Spanish, actually. So I'm very lucky. And I've read the book twice. I'm very excited now to read the book in English that just came out some days ago. 4 days ago, Alejandro?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's great.
Let me show it to you since we're doing a little promotion.
Oh, yes.
It's handle
I like that
books.
cover. So
Yeah, and that's the Spanish one, ¿Qué es la calidad en el arte? And the English one is titled What is Quality in Art?
What is quality of art? I'm sure everybody has recognized that cover.
Yeah, it's funny because, we'll get into this in a minute, but it is an obvious ingredient of relating to art. Quality is, whatever we mean by that. And yet, hardly anyone has touched upon it. People have written a lot about taste, for example, or beauty, but not about quality. And it's interesting to think of why that is. But mainly, I think we take it so for granted. It seems obvious that when we look at art, when we go to museums, we're looking at things that are good, that we don't really think of what do we mean by that, or what do they mean by that when they make the selection and show it to us. So let's see what we can do with that.
Right. So for anyone who, let's talk a little bit about Alejandro's background, because he's talking already about museums, and he's the senior curator of Flemish and Northern Schools at the Prado Museum, and he has a long trajectory at the museum. You've done exhibitions on all types of things. I was reading the catalog for Clara Peters the other day. That was an amazing exhibition. Last time I was there, I was lucky enough to be able to smell the gloves that you have, the exhibition you have now, to a very special portrait that we'll be talking about. We've talked in the Tudors Dynasty podcast, of course, of a portrait in your collection. How many paintings are there in your collection, more or less, at the Prado Museum?
Well, the Prado has about 8,000 paintings. Not a huge collection, a very notable one for its quality precisely, but not a huge one. Mm-hmm. We hang about 1,400 of those. We don't have room for any more. And of those, of the total collection, about 1,300 are Flemish.
Right.
So that's what I'm in charge of. And we hang maybe about 300 of those. So, big collection, but every museum of very high-end art in Europe or in the US or in the Western world that has paintings has mainly Flemish and Italian paintings. And that's because those were the places where a luxury industry, the production of high-end paintings, was localized. It was like, maybe not anymore, but when I was younger, watches, we said, came from Switzerland. Of course, they could be made anywhere else, but the best watches were Swiss. Mm-hmm. Well, back in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, the best paintings were Italian and Flemish. And any museum you go to in Europe or the US will have usually local art plus Italian and Flemish art. And that's because that's where people went to buy the best art they could buy. In talking about the Tudors, think of, Henry VIII goes abroad to find talent, and Holbein is painting him. Mm-hmm. And Henry VII is portrayed in a sculpture by Pietro Torrigiano, Italian sculptor. Mm-hmm. And in Spain, Isabel la Católica hires Juan de Flandes. Mm-hmm. Why are they all going beyond their borders to hire painters? Why do they need to go so far? Because they want the best ones. Mm-hmm. Now, again, what do we mean by that? That's the whole thing. That's the point.
Yes, and your collection is a very special portrait we've talked about a lot in the podcast of Mary the First of England by Anthony Moore in a very special room too, because it's full of portraits by Anthony Moore, and it's a room that you feel like you're walking into history in that room because of so many portraits that are there. And why are those hanging in that room and not others, Alejandro? Why is Mary up there?
Yeah, well, again, I would say in a museum that has, throughout its history, made it a tradition to focus on art, think about that. We can have a history museum or an art museum. In history museum, the choice would be more or less simple. What image or what object tells us best about some circumstance in the past or some event?
Yeah.
You may say that a certain hat or a certain cannon or a certain household item is most representative of something that we consider important that took place in the past. If we're talking about art, how do you make the selection for an art museum, say the National Gallery in London or the Prado in Madrid or the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna or so many great art museums? Well, traditionally, in the royal families that bought the art that ended up in those museums, the main criteria was quality, even though that was not stated. But the images that are there primarily because of their artistic value. And who's to say? Who decides? Well, we do based on a tradition that has reached us. Anthony Moore is an artist from Utrecht who paints mainly in Antwerp, but comes to Spain, paints in England also. He is called by the Spanish royal family and the English royal family and others in Europe because he's considered a very good portrait painter. And by that, what they mean is that he has a standard of something quite simple, really, which is of painting things that look realistic and that are made with art. It's interesting talking about portraits like Anthony Moore's portrait of Mary. We find several statements, documents in archives from that time, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, that talk about things such as a portrait is good. Dürer says this, Velázquez says something similar. A portrait is good because of its likeness. It looks like the person portrayed. We can't judge that. We don't know these people. All we have is Anthony Moore's portrait of Mary and some others, but we don't really know if it's lifelike or not.
Right.
But painters will say it's a good portrait because it looks like her and because it's made with art. I love that. It's made with art. But again, they're not telling us, what do you mean by that? And really what they mean is something as simple as it looks three-dimensional. It seems to have volume and space. That seems kind of like a given. It seems too obvious to unveil the secrets of art. But for a long time, it was a very hard thing to achieve. We've just become so used to in great museums looking at paintings that seem to have volume. Leonardo da Vinci talks about a good artist as one who can draw a hand that seems to raise above the sheet of paper on which it is drawn. He says it that clearly. That's what it's about. For a long time, art was not about that throughout the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance, when that starts to happen, it takes about 3-4 generations to achieve it. It's interesting to think about why is it so hard to do that? I'm not an artist. I can't draw a thing. Maybe that's why I'm fascinated by all this.
Yeah.
But it takes a long time to achieve this. And that's why they thought it was so important to paint things that looked real. And looking real mainly on a flat surface meant paint things that seemed to have space and volume. And that's what Leonardo and Velázquez is hired by a government in Madrid in 1633 to check on royal portraits because he is told they're not good enough. They go around town and see what people are hanging. We just wanted a quality control. And he goes around and says, indeed, there are a lot of paintings that are not lifelike and that are not made with art. And what he means is they don't look like the king. We can't judge that anymore. But also they're not made to look as if they were real faces, not painted faces. And that is something that took a long time for painters to achieve, and that was the standard. And that is why, Henry VIII and Isabel of Spain and all kings throughout Europe and queens and rulers and elite collectors went abroad to places where artists were capable of doing that, which was Venice, Florence, Rome, and Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp at first. And then eventually other people learned how to do that. And it's true that, like in our case, I mean, after centuries of that, it became something too obvious. And by the 18th century, the public is beginning to tire about that idea of quality, being able to paint realistically in terms of space and volume. And by the early 19th century, any ambitious young artist will simply be very bored of that goal. They no longer want to do that, and art starts a whole new chapter. It's reborn. The art of painting is reborn. But in the period that we're concerned with, it's about that, quite simply.
It's amazing. It is so linked to the Tudors, really, because it's all happening when, and this is starting to develop after reading the book, when actually there's all this turmoil in Castile, in England, the War of Roses, the Civil War in Spain, Isabel of Castile, and all those years. And then at the turn of the century, in the early 16th century, when I study someone like Catherine of Aragon, I find these little sparks of comments about certain things that when I was reading your book, I was like, oh, this is what he means about quality. Like Catherine of Aragon mentioning in 1505 to the ambassador that had brought portraits of Margaret of Austria that Michel Citao would do a better job, más ciertamente, so more accurately. And she uses 3 or 4 words just to describe just more accurately.
That's fascinating. I wish I had known that reference more truthfully. You could say,
yes,
also,
yes, más ciertamente, yeah. And then and it's funny because this is linked to her relationship to Margaret of Austria, because she's the governor of the Netherlands, of this place that is Flanders at this time, and how connected this is, because when the inventory of the goods of Margaret of Austria is carried out in Michelin in 1524, the only portrait that it's said to be a good portrait is the one of Catherine of Aragon, and I think of the Queen of England. So I think it's very interesting how these little gems that start to appear in the 1510s, the first decade of the 16th century. And it's, I mean, at least because this is what I study, very related to women and portraiture, and this kind of representing something that you talk about in the book, which I wanted to ask you about, those 2 terms, the idealism and the verisimilitude, these 2 terms that seem easy, but this is why I read the book twice, because I think this is a very deep book in many respects. Yeah. So can you talk a bit more about those 2 concepts? Because I thought that was very
important. Let me go back to what you said about Margaret of Austria and so on. For the idea that you get these little snippets of every now and then a reference to to an art piece which is good. Mm-hmm. It's a growing issue. It's a growing concept. One thing that you notice when you work in museums now is that we hang great things, art museums. Royal collections back then could not have as many good things. We've made a selection after centuries. Of 8,000, we hang 1,300. Right. The others are just not so good. This has always fascinated me. People like Margaret of Austria, but even later collectors that have a lot more paintings. A lot of what they hang is not that good. They just don't have enough great paintings. And that's one reason why they single out great art, quality art, because it's rare. It's not that easy to have. You can't have a huge central gallery full of major masterpieces like you do now back then, because there simply was not that much great art being produced. It took a while for this wave to become big. It's also interesting, we can talk a little bit about this later if you want, to think about how royalty, nobility, elite society thought of quality is something that they would naturally distinguish. Good taste and the taste for quality was something that they thought of as natural to them, and something would distinguish them from others, from the lower classes. And, in our democratic age, we've learned that this is not so. But for a long time, one of the things that defined high birth was, with time, as one grew up, good taste. And what was good taste? The ability to distinguish good art, good dress, good opera, good perfume, good whatever it is, good taste. In a way, it was a strategy, not conscious, of course, but it was a strategy to stay in power. There are things that are naturally ours if we are high-born. You can't have it even if you try to learn it. But going back to your question, that's how you define quality in art in technical terms, which is the only way in which you can define it going back to that time. verisimilitude means painting something that looks like reality, that looks truthful, even though it's not. In the definition of that word in modern dictionaries, you often find a distinction between the fact that it looks real, but it's not. That's the concept of verisimilitude. Plato was very much against representational art because he said it was not truthful.
Mm-hmm.
And that hasn't bothered most people, certainly not you and me or most art lovers throughout the centuries, but it did bother him. That's a useful reminder of what it means. It makes something which is not true seem true. It makes a flat surface on which a face is painted look like that real face. And the paradox is that that is tied into idealism. What art in Europe from the early Renaissance onward wants to do is something that they've inherited from classical antiquity, which is a form of realism, which is idealist. What do I mean by that? Well, you have to make things look real, say my face, if it's on the screen now, or yours, or whatever we're all looking at any given moment. You have to make it look real, but you want a little bit of a better version of it.
Yeah.
You want to make it to look slightly better, as if not from here and now, as if ideal from another plane, from a Platonic plane in a way, just a better version of everything that we see around us. And so that's the double goal of art for centuries in Europe. And it's really stated as such many, many times by them. And part of this whole book, what it does is try to answer the question, what is quality, but by seeing how they would have answered it back then.
Mm-hmm.
It's not our opinion now that matters about what quality meant for Elizabeth in the 16th century. What matters is what she thought about that. And those two things, realism and idealism, are very, very often mentioned. And so again, think about, I want to make a room or a person look realistic in terms of space and volume, but I want to make it a little nicer than reality. It doesn't really make sense in their culture to simply reproduce what already exists. What's the point of that? For them, it would have been mute, no point. It's like having shoes that don't allow you to walk.
Mm-hmm.
The point of art was to bring us closer to something better.
Right.
But in order to make that something better believable, it needed to look realistic in terms of space and volume.
It seems to me it sounds a bit like, not to make it frivolous, but like filters in Instagram, right? When you put a filter on your face, it makes it's still you, but an idealized version of yourself that it's not real.
Absolutely. But
Right.
think about something based on that comparison, which is very interesting and very real. Someone has made those filters. Someone has decided what makes us look better on Instagram, and what is it that we're going to better? Are you going to make the face that's a little rounder, or are you going to make wrinkles a little more invisible, or what? There's some. It's based on some decision, because you could imagine theoretically, imagine a culture where having one eye twice as big as the other is what makes you look better. So then Instagram would double the size of one eye.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the case, but it could be. Why? It's very whimsical to say that we look better with less wrinkles or with whatever. One of the things that I do in this book is try to find out, okay, so if they wanted to make things look better, what did that mean? What was better for them? And basically, it's an idea based on the aesthetics of the ancients, the standards set by ancient sculpture and architecture. There was very little ancient painting that was known at the time of the 15th, 16th, 17th century. But basically, they're basing themselves on ideas of beauty inherited from the ancients, which have to do with abstractions, such as making the shape of a head, which tends to an oval, making it a pure oval, and then maybe the shape of the hair above the head, making that seem round, and starting to make us move from an image that looks real into an image that looks like a bettered abstraction. That was their way of making things look better, and that's what the painters from the period we're concerned with inherited from them.
So you're saying that what Holbein reproduced was not really Henry VIII, but a better version of Henry VIII, probably?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look carefully at the famous portrait in Madrid in the Thyssen collection, indeed it is. I mean, think of every decision the artist takes, every stroke, or every layer, because paintings were made in layers. The first layer, you're drawing the outline. And then the second layer, you're drawing an undercolor. And then the third layer, you're putting the color over the undercolor. Why choose a certain undercolor? Because it's going to give a certain tone. Why draw in a certain way? Because it's going to make the shapes look more perfect. Perfect meaning what? With more art. The artist is making choices that imply I want to make Henry VIII look real, and I want to make him look interesting in some abstracted way, ideal. And ideal at a certain time can mean more beautiful, but it can also simply mean more formally more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a photograph, it's something a little more. It adds a little plus to it.
So going back to the book, what it seemed to me, and I wanted to ask you this question when I was preparing for this interview, is seems to me that this book has been a long time coming for you, because it seems like a deep reflection of looking at lots of paintings over the years, right? Did
Yeah,
you
it's
feel the
it's a,
void there? What draw you? Was it the years being a curator that finally were like, I need to write about this because nobody's done it?
absolutely, yeah, definitely. I've been kind of an orthodox academic art historian before I came into a museum, and there you're speaking, well, you're speaking to students very often, but also you're speaking to colleagues when you write mainly. I came from academia into the museum world 25 years ago. I came into the Prado, and since then, the focus really does turn to the relationship of the public to art and what they see and how they try to understand what they see, and really they're demanding or they're asking for help. That's what I've noticed. Really, people love to go to museums. Museums are a great success story. The Prado gets 3 million visitors a year. The Louvre gets 7 or 8 million. They're very, very high numbers. So they're a great success. But still, I have a sense after 25 years of how people are coming to museums wondering, what should I look at? And why is this good? Why is this hanging? Why does this matter? It's easy for them to go to history, for example, historical reasons. But if they try to think about artistic reasons, it's difficult. And you see this over and over again. So the book comes from an intention to help, maybe, to speak about a high-minded idea and issue in simple terms. But it is a book that it's ambitious in terms of what it's trying to address, and to make everybody understand that art is mainly about art. And how did Velázquez, when he said this painting is lacking art, what did he mean by that? Well, he meant, again, beauty and verisimilitude. And those are concepts that change through time. And to understand them, you need to go to local and contemporary sources to see how people are defining them. And you need to look into how artists said what they're trying to do. I'll give you an example. One day I was walking into the Prado with a good friend. I write about this in the book, and we walked into a room where I had hung temporarily a pretty mediocre version of Peter Bruegel the Elder's Tower of Babel.
Mm.
And we know the original, there's two originals, one in Vienna, one in Rotterdam, incredible paintings. And there are hundreds of versions of them. It was a very successful painting, about this size maybe, and it shows the Tower of Babel with tiny figures and distant landscape and so on. And this friend of mine was fascinated by that picture. He got close to it, enjoyed it, like he said he'd never enjoyed a painting. And he's not a frequent museum goer, but he really was taken by it. And all this time while I was standing with him, I was thinking, this is really a very poor version of the really good thing that was painted and which it is imitating. And there's no doubt that this is a poor version, and it's not subjective. It's not that I don't like it, but the painter could argue, hey, this is why it's great. It is simply not up to the standards that itself is trying to reach.
Mm-hmm.
When I told him this after all this, and I started thinking about it, I said, some things are subjective, but others, such as the illusion of volume of that round tower,
Mm-hmm.
the illusion of distance, and the beautiful clouds that in the sky that seem to take our sight into the distance, the rendering of the tiny little figures so that they seem animated and their expressions seem real. All that is achieved to such a high degree in the original by Peter Bruegel the Elder that if you compare that with this, it is simply very far from achieving what the artist has set out as his goal, which is to copy that original. And you could argue that he hasn't managed to paint such a great painting because he doesn't have time, because someone's paying him less. I don't think he could, and I don't think he could because for whatever reasons that have to do with his or her life, this person couldn't get well trained, didn't have the money to go through many years of training, or didn't have the talent. We don't know. That's irrelevant to the fact that when you're standing in front of that version of the painting, you're standing in front of one that's a lot worse than the other one. And this is not a matter of opinion. What you could argue about is, well, I like the worst one better. I find that it's more innocent. It's fresher. It's closer to me. I find it endearing to think about an artist trying to do something that he or she can't quite do. That's fine. But in terms of artistic quality, there's no doubt that it's a much worse painting in terms defined by them at that time. And, I would encourage our viewers now to go and get it again, Google Peter Bruegel the Elder's Tower of Babel. And then if you can find a worse version, do that too. The one at the Prado that we have, which usually I don't hang, it was hanging because when we lend paintings, we substitute them and hang something else. But look at the great one by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and look at the illusion of distance, look at the roundness of the tower, look at the million tiny little details painted with incredible care and effort throughout the ramps going up to the tower. And it's an incredible, incredible painting that shows all the virtues that they valued. Volume, space, detail, beauty, the sense of this tower being placed in the sky that is otherworldly, and the colors, the blue, an incredible painting. It is so exciting, and you feel you're so moved by it that what I wanted to do was try to explain to this friend of mine, look, I couldn't do it because we don't have the Peter Bruegel the Elder right there. But if you hung the two together, it's very easy to explain to someone the difference between a good and a not so good painting at that time. Imagine if you tried to do the same thing with an abstract painting made in New York in 1955. It's a whole different set of concepts and standards that apply. You couldn't do it there, or not in the same way. But back at the time when we were concerned about, you could. And Margaret of Austria or Mary or Elizabeth I or Henry VIII, they could tell. And that's why they say, I'll buy the bulk of my paintings to fill my rooms wherever I can, but I want to hire that star painter from Bruges or from Florence, and that's who I want to make my good paintings. Why is that? Because they know the difference between a great work of art and one that's not. It's very visible, hard to explain. That's what I try to do. And that day with this friend of mine, it was, I felt bad. He was liking this so much. In a way, I felt bad.
Of course.
But then again, going back to your question, you do learn in a museum that we have a role, which is to be mediators between standards of art set at a time that's far from us and the public that doesn't understand them or know about them. That's what we're trying to teach.
And I think that thinking about what you were saying right now, when we look at the Tudors, I think we make that emotional connection because of this verisimilitude, because of this idealism too, but they're represented in Holbein, for example. Obviously, when we talk about the Tudors, we have to talk about Holbein. You can almost talk to these people when you go to the museum. I can always have conversations with them, with Henry VIII in Madrid, or with Mary at the Prado. I always love to come and visit her. They're magnetic because when you close your eyes, you can still see them in your brain. Is this tied to that? This is what the book is saying. Is this the power of the Renaissance, really, of the art in the Renaissance? It's long lasting, they're classics in a way, right? Because there's iconic.
If you make a very good point, or an interesting one, because it's hard to come up with universal truths. Is the reason why we think an Antony's Moore portrait of Mary is so good that it makes her look so real? They thought so, and applied back then, indeed. But think about a portrait by Frida Kahlo now, an obvious image that we can all think about, which is not well painted in terms of its realism. That's not her goal anymore. That's not what painters were after when she was painting. But they have these incredible eyes, and the eyes make them feel very present. So art had learned throughout, 5 centuries later, that you can achieve presence and impact and empathy by other means, not only realism. And that's clear. If we go back to the 16th century, they thought empathy, realism, the appearance of someone alive being in front of you was achieved through realism, through verisimilitude. They had not yet made it to focus on the eyes. And even you could even paint a figure with only eyes, no nose, and mouth. Maybe it would work. in the hands of a very good modern artist. But back then, that's not what they were doing, and they had one path. And talking about empathy, it's interesting. There's a document by Philip II that says, as he walked throughout the palace, he would take his hat off in front of portraits of the royal family. So they did think of those portraits in terms of looking real. It's like having my brother, my daughter, my aunt, my family around me. And, you and I have both studied Isabel Clara Eugenia, Philip's daughter, with Isabella Valois, who ends up ruling the southern Netherlands, what's now Belgium. And she's always sending to Spain and asking from Spain portraits of her family members because she wants them there. So that is what she's doing. But again, the idea of quality in art at that time would imply the better painted they are, the more like having them here is. An artist now, an artist with great imagination, would achieve that in a very different way nowadays. So it's important to point out that the book is trying to explain art from a certain period only. I remember as I was writing the book, running into the problem of, technical quality. In a way, it's a very poor way of explaining what is so unique about art and the effect it has on us. But what I was trying to get at was what they were defining as their standards, what they were defining as great art. It's an issue because indeed great art is probably more about language than about content, probably more about how Mary's painted than about the fact that she looked real. But that level of that extremely high demanding culture in terms of realism just made artists learn and focus on their craft for so long, for so many generations, for so many years of studying at home, schooling, exams. It's extremely high level of standards for many centuries. It's what allowed later artists to get at great things in a very different way. If you spend all your life focusing on how to move a brush with the paste on a surface, you end up finding different things to do while you're doing that.
I completely agree. And what this book did for me is you don't read a history book or a book about the Tudors again in the same light, because you are thinking about these things now. Especially when I am reading books about the Tudors, I'm always trying to find the art, the portrait, the thing. And
Right.
Every time now, I'm always thinking about this because I do find these flashes. And they're usually linked to the women, which is another one of my lines of research. So I'm just really intrigued that women are so involved in this too. So now every time I'm just thinking back on, does it have a mention about if it's good, if it's not? And there are mentions, for example, in 1514, when a portrait painter, Margaret of Austria, sends a portrait painter to paint Mary, not Mary Tudor, the one in your collection, Mary Rose Tudor, the daughter of Henry VII, because she's betrothed to future Charles V. He says the painter did a very good likeness. But she had a portrait of him il est très mal contrefait. He was really poorly depicted. And that portrait is still in the Royal Collection in England. And I don't think it's just very badly depicted. It's just probably Charles V looked a lot like that, right? So going back to the Instagram moment, I think Titian, for example, gave Charles V a good Instagram filter when he painted him. And this is all the things that I think about now when I'm finding all these little gems that I find. So the book has certainly been very useful to me. And I think that it's something that I had never read about. And I've been studying art history for a long time. So I like books like that because the fact that it's not all about technical matters. You talk about trips that you've done and how they've influenced you and your trajectory. I think it's a very good way to understand that sometimes in life you understand things when you need to, but they're very obvious, but it's a good cumulative, right? It's over the years of thinking about these things and staring at a lot of paintings, I suppose.
Yeah, also, you study art history, so have I, so do a lot of people. What are we studying? Who's made that selection?
Right.
And, the answer there is clear. It's a tradition. It's people who have worried about paintings for centuries have written about them, just like who's written about knee injuries throughout the centuries? Well, people who studied that. What was the reason that they singled out that was behind the creation of a canon way back then? It was quality.
Mhm.
I'm curious about the portrait you just mentioned. I wish we could see it in the National Portrait Gallery because if Margaret is saying it's not well done, it doesn't look like him, she's saying. I bet it's not good artistically. Not only in terms of likeness, we don't know. We simply don't know. My favorite portrait in the world is a portrait of Clara Rubens. Rubens is one of Rubens's daughters, and he paints her when she's about 4. And I finished the book with that. And so she's so lifelike. Suddenly you stop and think, I never saw this girl. Maybe she looked nothing like this.
Right.
What's incredible about it is that you feel that the father's love of her is in that paint. He's painting how much she loves her, and that's where the sense of life comes from. So Margaret's saying this is not a well-made portrait. My guess would be I'm going to look for it after we finish.
Yeah,
And my guess would be it's not great art. It's not a good
Yeah.
portrait in the sense of, when Velázquez says
Yeah.
1633, do they look like the king and are they made with art? They're two different things. Now, I bet that painting is not made with art, but I'll look for it. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'll send it to you, and we'll put it on the show notes too, so people can check it out. Because I agree with you. I mean, I do not dare to talk about quality in front of you, but I think it is not a very good portrait. And I think that the good, amazing thing about this is that just a few years later, there's a woman that gives Charles a portrait of himself, Charles V. And very shortly after, Dürer makes a very, very short comment about Susanna Horenboot and her art and how her art has quality. So more to come on that because I'm currently writing about that. But so I think I'm this topic is really influencing a lot what I'm studying right now because it's there.
I would encourage you, Emma, to look for what you're already doing is to look for these references, not only little cracks or openings into history, but also into ideas about art.
Yeah, right.
And it could be quality, could be something else. But when in these texts that historians we read, long inventories and long lists, and we're always looking for a certain
Yes.
thing, and we skip all the others. Look for little openings that allow you to think about how they thought about art, what made art good or interesting or bad, or why they wanted it, whatever it may be back then.
Well, thanks to your book, I had to go back to all the inventories and look at them again. But some people like doing things like looking at inventories. I'm not gonna complain.
But their culture was so broad, so wide. You mentioned earlier a show that I did a few years ago about smells and odors. Odor culture as we see it in early European, early modern era paintings. I've gone through inventories for a long time looking for news of references, information about artists.
Right.
Suddenly, I go back to the same inventory and I see they mention ambergris, 5 grams. That's to make perfume, or they mention a master perfumer. I've been looking for master painters, court painter. Well, there's also a court perfumer. I've never focused on that person. And so there's so many other things that we can find, and each generation has an interest in new things, and we'll find new and different things in documents and inventories like you're doing.
Yeah. Looking for women artists is hard. So you just end up just looking at other things because you're like, well, she's not here, but there's a bunch of musicians next to the painters, so maybe they were related and this and that and the other. So yes, for sure, the going back to those inventories, and I think just reflecting on what we read, because I mean that's what books do to you, right? They just make you rethink what you already knew. So that's what the book has done for me, at least, and I'm sure that people will love it because it's a really thought-provoking book. So I'm sure people will like it.
Thank you. It comes from, even though the reason why I focused on it was a sense that I understood something that this friend of mine wasn't understanding that day in the museum. I do think I've already mentioned this, but I do have this concern that comes with age. Everybody after
I don't know what you're talking about.
This concern is that something that we valued a lot in the recent past is kind of losing focus. The radar is moving away from that. And that wouldn't matter, and this is artistic quality, and that wouldn't matter except for the fact that it did matter historically to these people who were buying, creating art back then. And this is what there's no doubt about. If you read through documents, through training manuals, through a lot of different things, you see this focus on this is what an artist has to do, and this is what makes good art. So it's not so much that I liked something a lot 45 years ago. Nobody, and my kids don't like it that much anymore. It's if you want to go to a museum like the Prado or the Met in New York or the Art Institute in Chicago, whatever it may be, and look at art, you need to understand. You don't need to understand anything. You can enjoy it any way you want, but you will gain a lot by understanding how they thought about art back then. So that's what this book is doing. It's answering these questions in the terms they would have used. And one question that came up in my mind a lot was, how come nobody's written about this, or hardly anyone? And I think the answer in the end, I think it's fairly clear. I think it has to do with the fact that now, think of quality as one of the ingredients that matters in art back then. Another one was expressiveness or intensity or beautiful color or whatever, different things. Technical quality was one of them. Paint things that look to have space, volume, and that are idealized. But you can have other qualities that people appreciated too. With time, technical quality doesn't matter in art anymore. Understood in the way they did back then. What matters now are other things, that art is intense or violent or ideological or whatever. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a different set of qualities, understood as a different set of characteristics. So when we go back then, it's important to realize that that characteristic, technical quality, was paramount to them. So that's really the whole point of this book, is to, in a way, what we are as translators of a culture from way back to our culture now. And so I do think that more people are going to museums than ever. That means people that have less of a training in art history. And therefore, I do think they have a hard time understanding how did Velázquez or Leonardo da Vinci define good art? They have no idea. Well, that matters because that's how everyone else defined it also. And I singled out a little sentence from Leonardo here, and he says, you can find many, many statements like this, but he says, the primary intent of the painter is to make a flat surface show a body as if it were modeled and separate from this plane. It's that simple. Mm-hmm. That's very hard to achieve. So both telling the public that's what they wanted to do, and that was very hard to do when nobody had done it. And, all these things beg the next question. So why does that matter to us? Right. And for me, it kind of works the other way around. I love this stuff. I'm trying to understand it.
Right.
To me, now that a face is painted in a way that makes it look round, that's not such an exciting thing anymore. We've been seeing that for so long. But I think the effort to do that took them and allowed them to connect with something great, poetic, that moves us, that stirs us greatly inside. That may be idealism. It may be this idea that I mentioned earlier, that when moving a pencil or a brush on a surface, you create beautiful things. It just so happened that was not what they were doing it for.
Right. Well, I think you're right. And I think, it's a success story because anytime I go to the Prado, you always find everybody wants to go and see Velázquez, everybody wants to see Bosch, everybody wants to see these artists that are from this time that you're talking about in the book. So it's still something that matters to people today. So I think that would be a great compliment. If anyone, the book, if you want to read before you have a trip somewhere to a big museum like that, and even if you going back to the collection you always visit, because that's what it does. It makes you rethink these things, and in terms of what those people thought about, and maybe understand a bit better Elizabeth I and why she chose artists from the Netherlands over artists from England, and how that changes in her reign. And she does have someone who is from England, but he's trained in a Netherlandish style. So, I mean, it's very interlinked to anyone who wants to learn more about art history in the time of the Tudors, because the Tudors do get influenced by these concepts of verisimilitude. This is why we like them so much, because we see their faces in these portraits and we feel like we can talk to them and know them, right? So I encourage everyone to check out the book. You can find it. We'll put it in the show notes so everybody can just use the link to go there. And Alejandro, what's next? What is next in the Prado?
Well, we are opening a show on October 14th, which is like 2 months from a few days ago, on called Rubens's Workshop.
Oh,
And there, what I try to explain is something related to this, which is the difference between a Rubens painting that's original and one that's made by his assistants. Rubens painted, we still know 1,500 works by this guy.
wow.
May have painted a few more. He was highly valued when he lived, so people kept his paintings carefully. But maybe say he painted 1,700 paintings. Most of them were painted with assistants. Many were not, though. There are many great Rubens paintings. And just how do you, this is something, again, that's happened to me with friends in the museum. So you say, this is a great Rubens, this is not. What I can't tell, I can't see the difference, people tell me. That's what we're trying to teach. And we're going to have 8 or 9 pairs of paintings where you're going to see the workshop one and the original one. And in one case, we're going to have a QR on the wall that we're going to explain to you the difference between 2 paintings, but not tell you which is by him and which is a workshop copy. And only once you get into the QR, you'll find the answer. So it's a way to bring us close to art back then, things that mattered. Rubens writes letters. He says, in one case, a client is complaining. He says, if you would have told me you wanted an original, I would have sent you one, but it would have cost you twice as much. He says things that clearly. And he has a menu, a list of paintings that is sent into a collector, Dudley Carleton in London, 1618. And it's a list of prices and who made them. And if you want, it can be more expensive if I retouch it, things like that. So I want to explain all that. And in the end, what's behind all this is just this incredible effect that art has on us. And why is this stuff so incredibly moving and so profoundly affects us so profoundly in things that are not what is reasonable about our lives, not about reason, but about poetic feeling or whatever one wants to call it. In the end, it's all about understanding that. And one way to do it is to try to always isolate what's great from all the rest. And then in doing that, you end up trying to understand artistic culture back then. So workshop systems are key to understand how art was made in big workshops by teams of artists following the guidance and the supervision of the master, who also made first-rate products for whoever wanted to buy those. So that's the show, a fairly small show, October 14th. So it's really fun because, sorry?
How long does it run for?
I don't remember the exact date now, but shows are typically 3 months, 3.5 months. So I guess end of January, I'm not sure right now. But right now we're going through the very exciting and laborious task of correcting all the book proofs and writing all the gallery labels and all these things that are key. Really, the labels especially, they're key because that's what the public is going to understand about the works is by reading what's on the walls. And I really encourage people to go to museums and shows and read what we say about what's there, because it's really very carefully thought out. And it implies relating to what you're seeing with a purpose, which is why the show is put up in the first place. In this case, to teach how things were made in workshop systems and how that implies different levels of quality.
I like how you always have that playful element in your shows, either the perfume of the QR where you find out if you're right. But this is great. Learning experiences is what we look for. Most people look for when they go into museum. They're moved by the art, but they also want to learn about stuff in an interactive way. Yeah. So congratulations on that. And anyone who's in Madrid can go and check it out starting October 14th, if I'm not wrong.
That's
and
right.
the book is out now in English too. And if you want to practice your Spanish, you can even buy it in Spanish because.
And that show will also have a book both in English and in Spanish. Everything we publish at the Prado, or almost everything at least, is in both 2 different editions in both languages. Yeah.
Okay.
I want to thank you, Emma, for all this. You're great. I mean, I follow you, as you know, but you're great, and I think your approach and your very close connection with this past. And it's funny because I think we all understand that in our personal lives, we are defined by our past, our childhood, our adolescent experiences, our parents, whatever. But we're not so aware of that in terms of societies, of history. And it's the same thing. We are what we are in part because of what we were, not only as individuals, but as as societies, as cultures, as groups, as nations, as whatever. So it's great to have your kind of approach to this idea.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm sure people will love it, and I'm sure you'll get another invite back. So everyone, have a great day, and we'll see you back. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please head on over to my Patreon page. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty for more information. Over there, you're going to find commercial-free episodes. You'll get early access, and there's some exclusive content as well, with more stuff to come as I'm rebuilding it. Also, recently I returned from England and cannot wait to go back. But this time I would love to bring you with me. So if you're interested to go on a tour of England with me, why don't you send me an email, Rebecca@tudorsdynasty.com, for more information. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.